Hey everyone, so let's talk about Chaucer. Um, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is another significant departure for us. Number one being that you're not going to be reading Chaucer in translation. Some of you may have read a translation or a more modernized version of Chaucer when maybe you were reading it in high school, but here you're going to be reading Chaucer in Middle English, which is obviously much closer to the English that we know and that you'll read, and even in early modern or modern English later on. Um, Part of the reason because now Chaucer wrote in the late uh, 14th century, right? And the Old English language in which Beowulf was written down has now been influenced by the French language, significantly because, most significantly because of the Norman conquest of 1066, right? So that's William the Conqueror comes to England, and now you have an influence of French language and French culture in British language and British culture, right? And I think that one thing that you need to recognize or understand is the significance of Chaucer writing in the vernacular of his day, right? Because a lot of writing from the period is in French, right? Also in Latin. And another thing that you need to recognize is that the age in which Chaucer is writing is not the Dark Ages that you may know of, right? This is an increasingly literate culture, right? There is a literary tradition in Britain at this time. People like Chaucer, Sir Thomas Malory, a little later, John Gower, right? There, and also Marie de France. There is a distinctly uh, literary culture from the period, right? So the Renaissance almost invents itself uh, after the fact in opposition to or by contrast from the Middle Ages. But there's a lot going on at this time historically, right? We're sort of coming toward the end of Edward the Third's long reign, and he is succeeded by his grandson Richard II, who had a very tumultuous reign, faced down a peasants' revolt, and was eventually forced to abdicate by um, Henry Bolingbroke, becomes Henry IV, right, his cousin. Um, and we're sort of seeing the conflict that would eventually become the War of the Roses, which dominated British politics in the 15th century, most specifically, and ended only with really the accession of Henry VII after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, right? So politically, there's a lot going on. Class-wise, there's a lot going on, right? Um, Class is becoming less regimented, I think, than it had been. You have somebody like Chaucer, who is the son of a winemaker, wealthy winemaker, and he is sort of entering and associated with the British court at the time, right? So there is a little bit of room for class movement or movement within the classes and upward mobility. You have obviously the church, right? You have the nobility and you have everybody else, but that group of everybody else is not a monolithic, homogenous group. They're everybody from peasants to, you know, more wealthy business people, shopkeepers, and whatnot, right? So there is a huge cultural transition going on with regards to language, and Chaucer writing in the English language is a significant thing, right? For British culture, for British literary identity, for British nationalism, right? Even though I may be using the term nationalism a little anachronistically, um, and politically, class-wise, and the like, right? And you get a sense from reading Chaucer his uh, having interact with a lot of different characters, right? In the general prologue, you meet people related to the church. You meet people like doctors, right? You meet business people, yeomen. So you meet a wide variety of characters in the general prologue. Um, Chaucer is a character in this text, right? He is the person who is going on the pilgrimage, right? So there have been a lot of crusades, right? Up until this point, a number of crusades by this point, and you also have the fact that people are, making these pilgrimages to holy sites and things like that, right? And so in the tavern, you meet this wide cast of characters. And I think that when Chaucer describes them in the general prologue, you have to sort of keep an eye on the way in which he is describing them, because he, in a way, is satirizing a lot of different kinds of characters, right? There is the pardoner, who is basically the person who's supposed to go out and give papal pardons, right? Catholic Church has a significance in England, a significant dominance in Europe in general, but England also specifically, right? Um, the way that he describes the pardoner, the way that he describes the prioress, the way that he describes the friar, right? He's doing it in a way that is more satirical and more critical than may be immediately apparent to you as you're reading it, right? So you have to be careful about taking what he's saying about these characters at face value and try to do a little bit more analysis and a little bit more interpretation in order to find sort of the criticism, right? Um, and that being said, you also, when you're reading the tales, you have to understand that the characters, the people who are telling the tales, right? We're only reading three. We're reading the miller's tale, we're reading the wife of Bath's tale, and we're reading the pardoner's tale, right? So you have to keep an eye on the way in which the tale teller is injecting himself or herself into the narrative, right? You can think of it as trying to be persuasive. You can think of it as trying to be um, moralistic, right? Telling a very moral tale with a very specific, like, here's what you're supposed to take away from it, right? Or you can think of it, in the case of the Miller's Tale, as something that's basically poking fun at human behavior. And in this case, this human behavior we're talking about is lust, right? Infidelity, these things like that. And these tales are much more bawdy and sexual and forthright about certain kinds of subject matter than you would really, you would necessarily, I guess, you would think of this culture, right? The Miller's Tale is not repressed by any means, right? And neither is the Wife of Bath's tale, right? So, and you also need to realize that we're talking about narratives that are very self-conscious of themselves as narratives, as, people telling tales from a very subjective sort of lens. So I think some of the things that you should think about when you're reading Chaucer is keep an eye, excuse me, on the point of the tale is, right? What the tale teller is trying to do, right? Is the wife of Bath trying to justify her experience through many different kinds of marriages, several marriages. She has 5 marriages, right? And her tale is sort of all about experience, right? And the pardoner, who is sort of very, openly and unabashedly corrupt, right? He preaches about avarice, but he never does anything for anything besides personal gain and profit, right? And then he tells a very apparently very strictly, straightforwardly moral tale about, greed, gambling, vice, and these sorts of things, right? And the miller is telling a very bawdy tale, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not something that we can take away from it, right? Sort of a lesson to be learned, right? Or maybe you may just see it as just a way of poking fun and satirizing human behavior and human folly, right? So that's up for you to decide as you're reading these tales. But like I said, focus on narrativity, right? Focus on the way the story is being told, and also think about who is telling the story, because these stories are very much tales being told by people, right? We have no illusion of, objectivity, right? These are from a very specific perspective. And note the way that the speaker injects themselves into the tale. Look to the introduction if you need a little bit of help reading the Middle English. Look to the footnotes. Don't use online guides. And if you have any questions, please let me know.